Hi everyone, John back again. I'm going to show my rock and roll. So James Griffiths, I guess, started a little thread to show you rock and roll. And well, I pulled out the battery. I've got quite a lot of rock and roll records. I've pulled out some of the ones that are perhaps a little bit more interesting to look at. There are certain artists that you can find compilations everywhere, and I kind of cruise the charity shops and bring home all sorts of stuff. Sometimes it's good stuff that's worth hanging on to, sometimes it's not. Anyway, somewhere in my house I've got some Johnny Ray records. Now I was going to start off with him. Purely because he is often credited as being, somebody that inspired a lot of the rock and roll music that perhaps came a little bit later on. I mean, he was sort of making music from the early 50s, and eventually, sort of, when the rock and roll period started around about 54, 55, he sort of was kind of included in that grouping, if you like. Well, I guess technically he wasn't, I don't know. But anyway, so I'm going to start here. Here I've got a record, Bill Haley, Rock and Soul, Herb Allen, Tony Tornado, The Shotguns. So it's one of those records where, there's a bunch of songs by Bill Haley and the Comets, and also they stick on some other songs by some other people. It's the way they rolled in those days, I suppose. So that's on Europa. Another Bill Haley record. Now this is actually, this is only on the Hallmark, so it's nothing exclusive, but this was actually a Bill Haley album. So it's not just a compilation, it's actually an album. And it's good. I always look at this picture and think, when I was a boy, the men in here, they looked like dads, what dads looked like in the 70s. Dads were, my dad, he was in the mid-50s, who would have been in his mid-20s. And a lot of men of his generation, they did sort of comb back their hair like that. They even looked a bit like that. So, it's funny to think that what was perhaps really hip and trendy and everything like that sort of stuck with a whole generation of people, and they kept it going. Even like through the 70s, eventually when they started losing their hair. Now, here's another record, and when I brought this home, I thought, oh, this is bound to be a reissue of the other one, but it's not. It's got a bunch of other tracks on it. It's also on Hallmark. I think I should look a bit closely into this. I don't know if this is another actual album or if it's just a sort of a generic compilation. Jerry Lee Lewis. This is a compilation, and it's an unusual one because it's got 6 of his sort of rock and roll songs, and it's got 6 of his country songs, and they're interwoven, so they play a whole lot of shaking going on, and then they've got a country song, Fool Like Me, and then they play Great Balls of Fire, and then they've got a country song, I'll Make It Up to You, and it just goes on like that through the whole album. I don't know why they've done it like that, but they did. Okay, Fats Domino. This is on Liberty, quite a nice copy. I've got a few of his compilation albums. It's lovely condition. And because he died just recently, didn't he? I've read just recently, while sort of preparing myself for this, so Fats Domino, he was the inspiration behind the name Chubby Checker. So we all know Chubby Checker for doing the twist. He called himself Chubby Checker, or found his stage name Chubby Checker, based on Fats Domino. And when you think of it, it makes perfect sense, but until someone points it out to you, you wouldn't know, would you? So, Little Richard. Now this is a record you can find anywhere in charity shops up and down the country, I'm sure. I mean, I seldom go out and don't see a copy of this record. I think I've probably got 2 or 3 underneath my desk here. It's live, it's raw, I quite like it. I don't know when it was recorded, but it's an honest record. I like it. It's really good. The next record I'm going to show is this. Now this is Little Richard's first studio album. And in many ways I think this is perhaps one of the earliest rock and roll albums. The thing is with rock and roll, a lot of the music, a lot of the things that the kids had access to, because it didn't get, well, popular music didn't really get played much on the radio, but rock and roll probably got played even less. Until sort of things changed up a little bit. But the trouble was the kids couldn't afford to go out and buy long players either. If they had any kind of pocket money, they could buy a single because it was much cheaper. And I think a lot of these artists, they sort of made their fame on the singles that they released before they had the opportunity to make, you know, long playing records. And the long playing records were often, yeah, just a collection of the A's and B sides and things. The whole concept of the album as we sort of think of it from the 60s and 70s hadn't really sort of developed yet. Now this I picked up for pennies. It's an original Little Richard. Sadly, yeah, it's in a bit of a poor state, but I like it purely because I know that this record is on London. This record was there. I always like to think, you know, some of my punk rock records are in a right poor state, and that's because, yeah, some of them were actually there in the punk scene when it happened. And I think that if you have, you know, records that are not in a poor state, if they're original records, then they weren't really there, were they? I think this one was definitely there, and I don't know who left it to a charity shop. Probably some old man that bought this in the 50s and thought it was amazing, you know. It's an incredible record. Sadly, this has a lot of surface noise. I'd love to get a new reissue of this. Maybe I will one day, but otherwise his you know, Little Richard's compilations are fairly easy to find. I really like the back cover here. Elvis Presley. I've got quite a few Elvis Presley records too. This is just a compilation called The Rocking Days. It focuses mainly on, yeah, his early stuff. On the back there's sort of pictures of his other records. I think essentially it focuses mainly on records that he would have made before he went into the army. And right here I'm going to break in. While I lived in the States a few years ago, I picked up some cassettes, well, quite a few cassettes actually. People were giving them away. You know, you'd go to yard sales and you'd buy the records or their CDs for, you know, $1 a time or something. But cassettes, they'd say, oh no, you can just have that. Now I came away with a whole load of cassettes, and this one was amongst them. This is Elvis, their first live recordings. This was released on This was released in I think about 82, and yeah, it's like his first live concert recording, I guess. It makes for interesting hearing. Of course, it sounds like any recording's going to be from way back then in the 50s, but the performance is really interesting. Yeah, so that's quite a nice little thing to have had. It'd be lovely to have that on vinyl, but I think it goes for a lot of money if you can find it on vinyl. Right, here we've got Brenda Lee. When I found this record, it swept me off my feet. I really enjoyed it for a long time, and I spun this a lot. Now, Brenda Lee, this is very rock and roll. I don't know much about Brenda Lee, but I do know that eventually she went into more sort of a country direction. And I've even got some of her records from her sort of country singing time, and they don't really appeal to me right now. But yeah, this is similar to the record that I just showed of Little Richard here. It's quite a rough record. You know, it's an old original, but it does sound great. It's mono. Let's see if I can get it out. It's on Pi International. Yeah, Chuck Berry. What is it John Lennon said? If rock and roll had a name, it would be Chuck Berry, something like that. It's a compilation. I showed this just recently, and this is on, yeah, it's on Chess Records. This compilation, Chuck Berry. I've got other compilations of his, but as with a lot of these stars, you know, the compilations, they come out at different times or whatever, but they've all got essentially the same tracks on, give or take one or two odd one, but you know what you're getting if you pick up a Chuck Berry compilation record. So Buddy Holly, he's the only one. This is one of those, I believe it was in a set of 3, but this is I think the first one of that set. It's one of those ones with this whole thing in the back, so if you see blue shine through, then it's stereo, but if it's red, then it would be mono. I like this record because it's a collection of tracks and demos that were released by Buddy Holly and the Crickets before they had a record contract, so you know, before they'd sort of made it. What I like about it is there's a kind of a rough edge to the sound. You know, it's a step or so closer to what eventually would go on to become rock music, because it's got that kind of crackle, that sort of rough vibe that you get in rock music that sort of wasn't quite there in much of the rock and roll music. But of course, yeah, as they went on further, then their sound sort of refined, didn't it, and become very smooth. Buddy Holly has this sort of very sort of smooth voice, doesn't he? Another compilation, greatest hits. Again, I don't have any more, fortunately, by them, because you can go out in charity shops and find Buddy Holly compilations. There's quite a lot of them around, a lot of them been made. Gene Vincent. This is something I think I got last year. It's volume 2. I don't have volume 1, but I didn't have anything by him until I found this. So yeah, it's quite good. Some of the tracks there. And this one is this is an interesting one. It's called The Greatest Party. Again, it's another one of these records where they stick more than one artist on there. So it's not necessarily a compilation, but it's an album with a mixture of songs by Gene Vincent and Wanda Jackson, and they interchange them. So, you know, Wanda Jackson sings one song, Gene Vincent sings the next one, and so on and so forth. It makes for an interesting listen. I don't know how they paired them up, but they did. Obviously. Eddie Cochran, Cherished Memories. I got one or two compilations by him too. This is on Sunset Records. I mean, he released, I think he released really only one studio album in his time. The second album that came out after he died was called Eddie Cochran's Memorial album, which is kind of a bit sad, isn't it? I think, you know, they released a lot of his music that never got released because the time that he was famous until the time he died was quite a short period. He could have been such a huge big star if he'd have carried on. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, how things would have changed. Everly Brothers. I pulled this one out of my purge box, my box or boxes I've got underneath my desk, where I put records that I don't intend to keep. It's one that I just brought back from charity shop, cleaned up nicely. It's mono. There you go. Quite a nice record. Whole, yeah, lovely condition. Not a scratch on it. I cleaned it quite well. But I don't care for their music, and I'll tell you what it is. It's their voices, you know, their close harmony singing, and the sort of the pitch that they sing at. I just find it irritating. It sets my teeth on edge. Right, Dion. So this was sent to me by James Griffiths a couple of years ago now. It's quite good to pull it out, play it now and again. But I will say this, that in looking up some of these artists now that I'm talking about in this video, towards this point, have been, all the ones that I've shown have been sort of right there smack bang in that sort of classic period between 54, 55 and 60. And Dion was part of a group, Dion and I can't remember, I'll put that here. And they were sort of like a doo-wop group, and they did very well for themselves. But then Dion left them and started making his own records and songs. But that didn't happen until sort of 1960, I believe. And he's got some tracks on here, like, you know, everyone knows the Wanderer and Run Around Sue. But we all know them. But I have to question, did rock and roll really sort of carry on into the 60s? To a certain extent, I'm sure it did, but I'm not sure. And I've often questioned that same thing about Roy Orbison. Here's a compilation of the very best of Roy Orbison. It's on Pi Monument. Again, you see Roy Orbison records out in the wild very often. This was a lovely one that I picked up. Again, one of those where it's not just Roy Orbison, it's Jerry Lee Lewis has got a couple of tracks on this album, and as do Tommy Rowe, whoever that is. Yeah, paid £1 for this. It's on Allegro. Yeah, so Roy Orbison didn't really sort of hit the ground, did he, until 1960 and onwards. And although I've seen him often, you know, regarded as being a rock and roll player, I don't know, is he really or not? I don't know. It's often said that rock and roll sort of ended in February 1959 or thereabouts, because that's the date when the plane crash happened that killed Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper and Richie Valens. There's also the fact that Eddie Cochran, he died in a car crash in England. He was touring with Gene Vincent, and the car left the road and crashed, and Eddie Cochran sadly died. I think that was I think that was 1960, so roughly a year after Buddy Holly and his crew had died. Chuck Berry, he got into trouble for something to do with people trafficking or something like that, or trafficking underage girls from one state to another for some reason, and he actually went to prison for a couple of years. But that happened in 1960, I believe. Elvis Presley, of course, he went into the services. He was, I don't know, did he volunteer or was he, taken into the military? I think that was for the Vietnam War. I can't be sure. Little Richard himself, he went on to become a preacher around about that time. And Jerry Lee Lewis, we know what happened to him. He came over to have a tour in the UK, and when he got off the plane, journalists asked him about his wife. Turned out his wife was only 13 years old, and he'd married his second cousin or something. How he ever, I don't understand how he would have been legally allowed to marry someone as young as that, but he had, and of course it was illegal here, so it could become a big scandal, and he, his success just sort of dwindled. He didn't really get much attention after that, not for a long time anyway, not like he was having. So all these things that happened around about that time, and so I've often seen it cited as 1959, 60. That was when rock and roll sort of finished, and of course with the 60s you had a whole new different type of music come up as well, didn't you? That was, eventually would lead on to the British invasion that went to America, and so on and so forth. Billy Fury, he he was a British guy. He he came around about the 1960 mark, so I don't believe he was actually anyone that was a rock and roller in the 50s, but like Roy Orbison, he seemed to sort of share that stage. Who else we got there? I think that's probably the last one, and then after that I've just got a few compilations. There was a movie in America called American Graffiti. This is a double compilation, it's a double album, basically the score of the film, I think. Nice record. And it's got 41 original hits. Yeah, it's got all your Rock Around the Clock and your all sorts of classic rock and roll songs. I've also got this one, so this is the follow-up. I don't know if these tracks were in the film or whether they're just inspired from the first compilation album, but this is a further 25 rock and roll hits, again from that era. Yeah, interesting stuff. And then this last one I've got here is Rockin' and Rollin' Greats, original hits with original stars. So yeah, this is like a TV advertised K-Tel, typical one that you can find in a charity shop, and it's got it's got a lot of the people that I've shown already. Bill Haley, Gene Vincent, Everly Brothers. I have Carl Perkins, I don't have anything by him. Anyway, so that's my rock and roll. I hope you found that of some interest. Okay, thank you very much everybody, and check out my next video. Bye. Well,